Right. Hello, everyone. This is episode 2, going through the Scrum Guide again. So we'll continue where we left off. All right. So Scrum Values. 'Cause this is to me, this seems like all good and absolutely makes sense within an agile team. But when you have to convert almost like a company from their old school ways to being more agile, it's they don't have these values already in. How do you enforce them, or how do you bring them about?
Is part of it just about, earlier we were talking about, there's a bit that says just start, just follow the guide and learn the moves and learn the events and learn what value it gives. And I wonder if part of the adopting these 5 values come from just embracing the system, if you like. And one of the things that I frequently say to my teams is that James Clear line about you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. Teams can reach for their goal, but if you don't have a system to help you get there, then you may not reach it. But if you've got the habits in place that incrementally help you reach that goal, even on your worst days, then as it was the former 49ers coach said, the score will look after itself. You'll reach the goal. Yeah. And I wonder if part of it is just the fact that these values are so built into the way that Scrum works that, I don't remember. This has just made me think maybe I need to be making these values more explicit in the things that I say with teams. But actually, the way that the teams often work, they're exhibiting commitment and focus and openness and respect and courage anyway.
I think I agree with Gareth, but I think the commitment one is the easiest to spot, especially working in Scrum. However, as you progress, I think they become less and less obvious, like as you go through the sentences, because to have the courage to do the right thing and to work on tough problems, that may not happen as often. And it's also interesting that they use one sentence for each of these, because as values they apply in so many different levels, and they should apply to so many different levels, but it's also a bit open-ended. So having the courage to do the right thing, sometimes we just, as Gareth mentioned, and by the way, the book is Atomic Habits by James Clear for whoever wants to read it. To do the right thing sometimes means to step outside your comfort zone. We don't rise to that as often as we want to. So perhaps that's something that we can actively pursue as Scrum Masters. I think that's my take on it.
Yeah, but especially kind of going back to courage, what you just said, in a company that almost like values hierarchy, almost like old school value, let's call them. What's the difference between kind of being courageous or having the courage to speak out, and almost being a bit reckless, or reckless with your own, being a bit, hesitate to say stupid, but it's effectively what you can get persecuted for being courageous in the wrong environment. It courage requires a certain, what's it called, company culture to be allowed.
Yeah, to some extent, but there's also a fine line. Like even in the right company culture, you may have the courage to step up and say some things, and you may call it courage, but it can just annoy people, and you can think yourself courageous. So it always depends. It's quite hard to give a simple, proper answer where you draw the line between courage and something else. But yeah, definitely I agree with the fact that the more hierarchy there is, the more restricted these values can get. So respect may become fear, and courage may take a completely different shape. Openness may not exist to some extent. It just, you present what needs to be presented. You don't really improve transparency in any way. Focus is not something that you commit towards. It's something that is given, passed down. Sorry. So yeah, I think Scrum works best at just one level between teams rather than going up the hierarchy chain. And I think these values showcase that.
And I think I said this in the last episode that, you know, there are agile frameworks like XP, like DSDM, that have these kind of prerequisites that said, you know, if you're going to be using this, you really need buy-in from above, from management, and make sure you've got that empowerment from them, and that they will empower the teams and allow the teams to make the decisions that, you know, the suitable decisions, or the appropriate decisions. And there's something that I say to my children a lot. We don't do brave things because we're brave. We become brave by doing brave things. You know, and I think there's that courage is the one that I always hold on to when I'm working with teams and working with companies. And I worked with this fantastic business analyst who used to speak the truth, even if it made his voice wobble. And you could see his nervousness and you could hear it in his voice, but he had that courage just to say, I think we're doing the wrong thing here, or what if we did it this way? And I got so much, I had so much respect for that, but I got so much from watching that and being part of those events, to try and do the same.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and then I guess it's you change kind of a culture within a system that doesn't, maybe is too hierarchical. The first person to speak out is always kind of the hardest, but then everything else follows suit after that. Once you break the mold, it's almost, yeah, you start making the first few steps. But another question that I kind of want to maybe focus on is, what is the difference between the value of openness and the pillar, the Scrum pillar of transparency? They seem like they overlap.
And he's gone. He's now transparent.
I think I want to keep that joke.
An amazing moment to drop his connection.
Okay.
Oh, he's back.
Yeah. So it's effectively, what is the difference between the pillar? Can you be transparent without being open, and vice versa?
I think the transparency is more passive and the openness is more active. So the transparency is about making the work visible and making the artifacts of work visible. So like information radiators, what is the work? Putting the work up on a board, whether it's a physical board in a room or it's a Jira board or a Trello board, and it's telling us, it's showing us the information, it's showing us where the bottlenecks are, it's showing us where the flow is happening. I think that openness is an attitude from the team about a willingness for them to be transparent about what's going on.
I think that's a really good answer. I'm not even sure if I should add on to that, because that's a really good answer. But it's like we talk about now leading and lagging measures. Basically, transparency is a lagging measure, and openness is a leading measure in this case.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. And moving on to the Scrum team. Okay, so it does go into detail afterwards of what the developers and every single role is, but coming back to this, these are the only roles defined within kind of the Scrum guide, within the framework overall. However, you do end up in a lot of cases having project managers having different roles, uh, basically almost put in or having to be converted, or is that, would you consider that to be still Scrum, or is that, as Andrei put it before, Scrum but?
Well, they don't necessarily work in a Scrum team if it's a project manager, and you can still do Scrum if you have other roles. So that's my opinion, at least.
Yeah, and it does say earlier in the Scrum guide that, if anyone's getting value or putting in value or involved in the creation of the product, then they're just regarded as part of not just, but they are regarded as part of the development team, the developers.
One thing we may want to unfold is what the Scrum team consists of, because it specifically defines one Scrum Master, one PO, and developers. And there have been so many discussions, and I think I've recently read an article that, for example, the Scrum Master was not intended to be a full-time role within the Scrum team. I'm not sure if that's true. I may look it up, and in case I find it, we can link it. But what do we think about these roles? Like, should the Scrum Master, since we're on that, should the Scrum Master be a full-time role on the team?
Yes.
In the sense,
Speaking as a Scrum Master, yes, please.
Speaking as someone who gets paid to do this.
Yeah.
well, in the sense that, should you, as a Scrum Master, should you have just one team?
In the past, I've worked with one team. I've worked with two teams. I've worked with three teams simultaneously. The three teams, God bless them, were largely like neglected feral children. No, they weren't that bad, but I really didn't know which way was up most of the time. I would be racing from one event to another, trying to context switch between what were the issues that we're dealing with, what's the product that we're building, how can I best support them. It wasn't manageable. I think two is probably the maximum. Yeah, I love working with just one, but you do get to a point, especially if they kind of get to be quite mature quite quickly, you do begin to get a bit bored, because they're doing stuff, they're thinking in that way.
That's a good point. Would you say, Gareth, that if those three Scrum teams would have been working on the same product backlog and the same project, would it be easier to help them to be their Scrum Master?
I suspect it would, because that aspect you're not switching between, and it's then you're just then thinking about how do you get the most out of the team, and you're focusing on them and their skills and their abilities and the challenges that they're coming up with.
So it kind of then, would it be useful to just specify definitely one product owner per product? More than that, you end up kind of butting heads, and less than that, it's obviously non-functional. But maybe having one Scrum Master should not be split between more than one project, or maybe maximum two projects, two products.
It's hard to be prescriptive about this. I think, as Gareth mentioned, you also take into account, first of all, team composition, also how mature the teams are. And I think, in my case right now, it just happens that I've got 4 teams, but 2 of the teams are forming, and it's the workload is not yet I'm not yet fully on both teams that I feel the stretch from everywhere else. So I think it depends, because when they're going to be fully formed and when they're going to start being more productive, for lack of better words, then there will be a lot more issues. So right now it's just baby steps, and so yeah, there's a lot of ifs and a lot of conditions to this question. I think Gareth also wanted to say something, and I stepped in before you. Sorry.
No. But what you were just saying just reminded me. Mike Cohn, who's one of the big writers in the Scrum world, has a really good paper called Situational Scrum Mastering, which I found really helpful, where he talks about the maturity of different teams and how what's our response or what's our approach to different teams. So if a team's fairly new, we pretty much take a kind of telling perspective. We teach them the moves, we teach them how to do things. You then, once they've kind of got a bit more maturity, it's more of a kind of selling, more of a kind of coaching, more of a kind of trying to pull them out. And then I can't quite remember the other two, but as they progress in their kind of maturity and their adoption of it, you then start delegating stuff to them, and then you get to a point where you're pretty much just supporting them, like a kind of, I don't know, potter or something, just kind of gently nudging them in the right direction. I always see my role as a Scrum Master to try and do myself out of a job, to get the team to be as agile and thinking in that way themselves, that I just have to sit there and nod
And be amazed.
Yeah, and praise them.
Yeah, I think that's the goal, that's the target. I never got there so far, that I'm not useful anymore in a team, but I think there's also the idea ingrained in us that there can always be something better. So perhaps the job is never done in that sense.
Well, and there's the instinct of self-preservation of I still want to feel useful, I still want to do things. So you have to almost go against your instinct of keep making yourself useful or continuing to be useful. Of just, if you get the team to be fully managed and there's no more need for you, you've won. You're ready to move on.
I wanna ask a question here, but also Gareth wanted to say something, so I don't want to interrupt you again.
I was just going to say, I think there's another factor this. We were talking about the size of teams. It depends how big the team is. Because if you've got a team of 3 people, 3 developers, a product owner, and a Scrum Master, that's 5 people. That's 10 lines of communication in that team. If you've got 10, as it says here, 10 or fewer, if you've got 10 people in a team, that's 45 lines of communication. And that just, that's far more complex to deal with. Just communication, besides their personality clashes and all of that sort of thing. So yeah, if I had 3 teams of 3 developers, that seems to me to be a lot more manageable than dealing with 30 people.
Fair enough. So I want to ask the question, which was, what's your opinion on this? Because I wanna see if it's similar to mine. But at some point, let's say you're a Scrum Master for a team for over a year or over 2 years. Do you think that at some point perhaps you're too close to it, and if you don't find a way to step back to revisit some of the problems and objectively look at them, do you think it's also worth considering swapping teams to get like a fresh pair of eyes working on that team?
I think there's value in stability within a team and familiarity. I think there's other ways that you can get that external opinion, bring in another Agile coach to observe, to ask questions. I've done that in the past, and that was hugely valuable. Just somebody came in and he sat and he took notes, and he observed for a few days, and then we sat and had a conversation, and he said, I've noticed this and I've noticed this, and it was so valuable. So essentially having like a mentor as well, or whether it's a co-coach or a mentor, there's definitely ways that you can improve without having to disrupt the whole team. Don't take my team away from me. I love them.
And kind of instinctively, when you asked that question, I just thought of that would probably be not necessarily bringing an external Scrum Master. It wouldn't be your call. It would probably be the team's call. You'd probably ask them if they feel the need of a fresh perspective. I think just kind of making that, it's almost making a top-down decision, which I'd want to avoid, of going like, okay, I need to move. We need to switch to Scrum Masters. If the developers feel probably that a new perspective would be very useful, that might be a useful exercise, or simply, as Gareth pointed out, have somebody shadow you and give you feedback, give you that new perspective. But just changing teams like football teams change coaches, it's not as useful, I don't think.
Yeah, at the same time, you also may have, and I've encountered this, you may have teams that completely reject the Scrum Master. Because I honestly think that not all Scrum Masters are fit for all teams, and there are certain personalities that don't really match, or there's work style, or anything. It can be a lot of things. So perhaps even that, if you identify it even later on in the game, even after 6 months or 1 year, it can be more valuable if there's a switch happening, rather than stick with stability, almost like a relationship. If you find that something doesn't work, rather than stick it out because you made a choice and you want to be stable,
Well,
you adapt.
here's a controversial take to that. Be agile more than just be a Scrum Master, and if the team rejects the Scrum Master as a position, maybe XP works best for that team. Maybe you have a different framework that fits that organization or that team best. I mean, we had guests on in previous episodes, developers that were team leads that were working in a bit of a XP framework ish, although they didn't call it XP, but where they had a team lead doing a lot of the responsibilities that a Scrum Master does, and they didn't really want a Scrum Master. So it just might be that not every organization needs to implement Scrum in the purest form.
As much as I agree with that, I also know that a lot of my friends who are working in IT have done Scrum quite poorly in the past, and they never actually had a proper Scrum Master, so they don't really see the value in a Scrum Master. And that propagates, and that information propagates, because those team leads have once been juniors and they never had Scrum Masters. They only had different colleagues or seniors that they looked up to, and they always worked in that way. And same as we had someone come in and say, basically it was Marius that said he doesn't find a lot of value in retrospectives, and someone with the same role was on the opposite end of that spectrum, saying that retrospectives are, according to him, one of the most important events in Scrum. So I think it's also, this is highly dependent on your experience with it. Obviously, it doesn't work for everyone, but there's more to unfold with that.
Absolutely. I think a bad Scrum Master does a lot more harm than good to the industry as a whole, not let alone to the team, because it just leaves them with the impression that Scrum is not for them, even though they've never tried proper Scrum.
Has anyone had teams that were bigger than 10, like quite bigger, let's say 14, 15 people.
Constantly, even me right now. And that's one of the things that I've been fighting, because it's a company that's in between. It's almost like in the middle of the transition going from a waterfall system to an agile system. And I managed to allow me to split the team in two and have two separate Scrum teams working on the same project, just to make it easier to basically manage themselves. It took a long time to get to that point. The teams would have benefited from getting there, I believe, a lot quicker, but it's still, I think if you have more than 10 people, definitely a lot more than 10, is just beneficial to just have them split themselves in two.
I had the opposite. I had two teams that I was looking after, but they didn't have all the skills required to do their own work. So we actually merged the two for the events, for the Scrum events, like sprint planning. And we essentially had one sprint backlog, and then worked out each sprint who were the right people to work on different pieces of work based on the skills required. And then they went off and worked on them on separate boards. So we had so there were still two teams, but we had one sprint backlog.
That's interesting.
And it worked really, really well. But what was really, really great was the fact that here were two teams who vaguely knew each other, but actually by the end of it, a couple of sprints down the line, their relationships were so much better, and the openness between them was so much better. I'm not sure what happened to them. I suspect that they went back to being two teams once they'd kind of, backfilled all the skills and the roles. But I'd left by then. But yeah, that was an interesting way, and that came from the team pretty much as well. We kind of sat them down and said, how are we going to do this? And they suggested, well, I know this stuff and you know that stuff, so let's work together. I was really proud of them.
We're actually at that part in the Scrum guide where it says that teams should share the product goal and the product backlog, but it doesn't say the sprint backlog. So it's the first I hear about sharing sprint backlog.
Well, I think, to put it this, you have to be agile first and kind of a Scrum Master second. So if there's an agile solution, then absolutely implement it. And yeah, as you said, Andrei, it doesn't, come to think of it, it doesn't break any Scrum guide rules, but even if it bends them a little bit, if it works, it works.
I got part of my inspiration from that. There's a guy, Carl Scotland, who used to work for BBC, and he wrote a paper called Agile Planning with a multi-customer, multi-project, multi-discipline team. And he talks about that kind of needing to use one single backlog, but then multiple teams working on that backlog. It's a really interesting article.
I'm writing down all of the books that we're talking about, and I'm going to try to link them in the description.
In fact, I wrote a blog post about it.
Oh, give me the link to the blog post as well. I'll definitely put it in the description.
Cool.
All right. So moving on to the developers. A first question that kind of pops up in my head, and this is something that I've maybe struggled with, not necessarily myself, but the team, because it's almost like a multicultural team from people from all over. The difference between calling somebody a developer or a software engineer or programmer or using these terms interchangeably, it can be quite confusing. And developers here basically include business analysts, testers, anything that the skills, any specific skill that the team would need. But I've noticed, I don't know if this is just the environment that I work in, that developers is mainly just refers to software engineers, programmers. Is that the case with you guys as well, or is it just a unique situation that I'm in?
I think definitely for me, yes. I also when I was a software engineer or I did coding, I also referred to myself as a developer or a programmer. So I think it was just the lingo that we had, at least in Romania. So it is confusing though when you are discussing the Scrum Guide, and it just happens that today I discussed the Scrum Guide with a team that was really new to Scrum, one of the teams that I mentioned earlier, and I was pretty much presenting the Scrum Guide, kind of best practices, stuff to stay away from, and I kept mentioning developers. And at some point, someone asked if it's just the developers or is also the QA involved in that, because I never mentioned the QA, and I had to specifically say that, as the Scrum Guide says, like developers is used with a capital D there, and at least that way, whenever I use developers in the Scrum Guide sense, I use capital D because to me it's easier to spot and separate from the typical developers that I used to call. So I'm not sure. That's my case, at least. On that.
We could solve this really easily by using the term that DSDM uses, which is Solution Development Team, which covers solution. They cover solution developers, solution testers, so engineers, QAs, but they also include the business analyst, because that's a role in that framework, the team leader, and the business ambassadors. So the customers actually sit within the team, within the solution development team, which is a kind of XP thing as well. So yeah, I frequently remind my teams that when we're talking about developers, it just means anyone that's helping to build the solution that we're creating. They'll get it eventually.
Yeah, but that's kind of what, as you pointed out, is would it be Gareth? Would it be useful to just use a different terminology to avoid confusion?
I think so, but I frequently use that anyway. The solution development team. That's quite clear.
I'm usually using the team as an overall. Even that's confusing as well. But sometimes I feel like if I mention the team, then it's clear that it's the developers, at least in my case, because the Scrum Master almost acts, well, it depends from organization to organization, but almost acts outside the team as much as inside, and product owner, same, is not necessarily part of the team in that sense. So the team that is responsible for the daily sync or for the increment, then that's the team.
No.
One thing I want to point out, which is something that is nice to reiterate, the first thing that they are accountable for is the sprint backlog. And although I think this is quite common knowledge, so I'm not saying anything new, but the difference between the sprint backlog and the product backlog is that the developers are accountable for the sprint backlog, and whenever something comes in or out, they need to agree with that. So changes done to the sprint backlog should happen with the developers in mind and with their collaboration, because I think that starting as a Scrum Master, this wasn't clear to me in the beginning. And I just want to reiterate for anyone there who is encountering the same issues, this is something that is a good practice and it should happen in proper Scrum.
And a useful phrase when you're bringing things into a sprint backlog, a useful phrase to use is, if we're saying yes to this, what are we saying no to? If there's questions of priority, I found that to be a very powerful question.
Yeah, that's a good one. And it is a negotiation.
Yeah.
And another thing which I want to mention is even if the sprint backlog changes, the sprint goal should not change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another one to keep an eye out for.
And it makes sense. And I know a lot of teams will bring stuff in to the sprint and feel that it's fixed in stone. But, as you, because we're working in iterative, incremental development, as you dig into things, as you learn more during the sprint, it's okay to start breaking stuff down. And, this is a big story, but it would be better as two smaller stories. Or actually, we don't need this bit, so let's bin that. It's okay. It's the team's artifact to help them to be transparent, to help them to adapt. Inspect and adapt. That happens not just at these big events like the retrospective. This happens every day in the daily scrum. The daily scrum is part of sprint planning. It's what's our goal? How far have we got? What direction do we need to go today?
When we're going to get to the daily scrum, I think it's going to be an interesting topic, which will be next episode most likely.
Yeah, probably, but yeah. And it's also it interesting that it specifies instilling quality by adhering to a definition of done. I guess is because it's a more, and we'll get to the definition of done a little bit later, but it doesn't specifically say kind of defining or kind of creating the definition of done, even though they are involved in it quite a bit. But at least in my case, like it's usually the developers, the Scrum team that develops that works with the product owner, but it's them that I guess flushes out the definition of done more so. Is that the same situation with you guys, or is somebody else's responsibility entirely?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's somebody else's responsibility, but I have encountered places where the definition of done wasn't fully in the hands of the Scrum team. And I have encountered places where a team that was newly formed just went through the definition of done and tried to figure out what to put in there and what to leave out. So perhaps, yeah, I think it's trying not to be prescriptive at this point and just saying instilling quality by adhering to the definition of done. Basically, it says that make sure the increment at the end of the sprint meets the definition of done.
And there can be multiple definitions of done, depending on what you're looking at. You could have a definition of done for a user story. How do we know when this is done? But you could also have, say, for example, a definition of done for a deployment, to make sure that there's quality in that particular task.
Perfect. Moving on to product owner. It seems, to me, it seems it's just having a singular, almost like a purposely placed bottleneck for the product, just to kind of have a singular vision for what the product is, for cohesion, most importantly. But I don't know. It just my personal experience. And I'm pretty sure this is just kind of completely different from all other organizations, but I haven't had very positive, I guess, experiences with product owners. But that's mainly because of experience and because of, I guess, not quite understanding their roles.
It's weird how you framed it, that there's a bottleneck. So the product owner is a bottleneck. I'm not sure of that, but it's understandable why there should be one product owner that looks at the product backlog and not a committee. And this may be the worst quote of the series so far, but I was watching a TV show called Dark, And in the second season, an inspector comes over to look at a difficult case of some missing people. And the town is rioting that they only send one person, and why that is. And basically, I think he quotes someone else, but basically he says that if 10 different people look at an elephant from 10 different angles, they describe 10 different things. But if one person looks at the elephant from 10 different angles, he describes or she describes the elephant. So yeah, I think that's the case with the product owner as well.
So the product owner should be the elephant in the room, and we don't discuss that.
Well, the backlog in this case is the elephant.
And the product owner, is also there as like the pseudo customer in a way to represent the end user. So I mean, maybe it doesn't state that explicitly here, but yeah, I would expect a product owner to be listening to and meeting with customers, end users, and to fully understand what is it they need, so that they're building value. They're building value into the backlog, stuff that will actually get used, that will actually be useful.
Yeah. And just going back to the first comment, I think I almost like purposely used the word bottleneck there, because a bottleneck isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's a part of a book that actually you recommended, but it's a really brilliant book, The Bottleneck Rules, which is you think of where the bottlenecks are and where they should be, because every company will inevitably have the bottleneck. But if you put it in the more appropriate place, you end up maximizing efficiency. And I think this is one of those examples. If you end up creating the product owner as the bottleneck for the product development, then that is maximum efficiency for the team.
That's Clarke, Ching, isn't it? The bottleneck.
Yeah. Clarke, Ching.
Yeah, and you want like you said, you want the bottleneck in the right place.
Regarding what Gareth mentioned, that it doesn't specify that the product owner should have also the users in mind, or it kind of says that the product owner may represent the needs of many stakeholders. Now, the stakeholders throughout the Scrum Guide is purposefully vague, and one can argue that includes the end user as well.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's that balance between what does the business need and what do the users need. Poor spikes. People say Scrum Masters have a hard time. I think product owners have a hard time.
No, I genuinely think that it's a lot more of a technical role, and it's not. It's almost harder in certain aspects to do, and it's not, I guess, respected as much as it maybe should be. It's both soft skills and technical skills, like a mixture to have the product be coherent and basically have efficiency.
I've worked with some amazing product owners that just astounded me. I mean, one was, I don't know how old, 19 years old. Absolutely astonishing young man. Knew the thing inside out, knew everybody they need to speak to, knew the end users. I was, blown away by him. So yeah, they're definitely, just to give you some hope, Vlad, there are some good product owners out there. Yeah,
it is a hard role. So yeah,
going on to the Scrum Master.
So I think there's a lot. This is going to be a big topic. So there's a lot to unfold here, and especially having 3 Scrum Masters in a podcast, that's a tough one. So let's start with the beginning. So you are accountable for establishing Scrum as defined in the Scrum Guide. First of all, just let that sink in. And indeed, this is the empowerment part, which I think there's also, I think I just saw a discussion recently on LinkedIn where a lot of Scrum Masters. Oh, I forgot who posted it, so I'm sorry. But I saw a post that a lot of Scrum Masters are looking to get empowered. But should you, I mean, it says that the Scrum Masters are true leaders. If you're a true leader, should you actually wait to be empowered? Or how do you grab that power? I'm not sure if this is necessarily a question or just an open-ended thought just to put out there. But yeah, I think my main approach would be to find a way to be empowered, or to find a way to be that Scrum advocate in case you decide that Scrum would be the best approach for the team. So I'm not saying be a Scrum preacher, which is a big no-no, but be a Scrum teacher.
I think a useful term that is not necessarily here, but is used quite a lot is servant leader, where it's basically trying to empower the team. But effectively, what I've also kind of noticed in a lot of situations is you need to, and this might be because I come from a business analyst kind of background. The way that I had to approach things was simply understand the limitations of the company and how agile they're willing to be, and implement Scrum in the best way possible within those limitations. So you find the limits of your empowerment by basically analyzing, asking questions, communicating with your, almost like the organization, the higher ups. Obviously you try to negotiate to have those limits as wide as possible, but then you understand how empowered you are within the limits, within each organization's limits.
I like that term servant leadership as well, which was removed from the previous version of the Scrum Guide, because in that paragraph they did talk about Scrum Masters are servant leaders, and they removed that because they wanted more of an emphasis on leadership. That yes, we were servant leaders, but there was a misinterpretation seemingly that Scrum Masters are supposed to be servants first and leaders second, and they wanted to kind of just say, look, you're true leaders, and part of that is about servanthood, about serving the team. And it took a while, because I really like that phrase. It took a while for me to kind of accept that.
To go to a quick kind of example of that, a slightly different approach to the servant leader, I guess, phrase is a book, Turn That Ship Around, which basically just refers to implementing a leader system in which you're empowering the people underneath you to be leaders in their own right. So I think it's that may be a bit more clearer than just servant leader, if that creates that misconception.
I think that certainly in this description of Scrum Masters, right at the beginning, the Scrum Master is accountable for establishing Scrum as defined in the Scrum Guide. And that goes back to what we were saying about not becoming Scrum Guide police. It's about establishing the team, about helping, at the start, the team learning the rules and following the rules. It doesn't say that we should continue and enforce Scrum as it is defined in the Scrum Guide. It is that idea that it's a framework, and that as we mature, we begin to kind of embody what we're doing. And we don't later on, we don't need to follow the Scrum Guide to the letter.
Sorry, that's a very common mistake of using the Scrum Guide as a Bible.
That's basically the Scrum preacher I was referring to.
I do have the Scrum Guide on speed dial in my work browser. I frequently bring it up and occasionally go, the Scrum Guide says maybe we should be returning to that if they've kind of strayed way off the path.
Sometimes it's good to come back to the basics.
I was a preacher, but I'm not a Scrum preacher. For those who've listened to my episode.
Yeah, they don't go together. So it says the Scrum Master is accountable for the Scrum team's effectiveness. Now, this was always a tough thing for me to understand how good or how bad I am as a Scrum Master. And quite often the feedback you get from the team, well, at least directly, it's not transparent enough, or maybe that is. I mean, I usually end, let's say, retrospectives with what am I not doing well enough, or how else can I help, or what extra thing I can do to ease your lives. And I think every time I get silence, no answer. So I don't get enough feedback. Now, Scrum Master being accountable for the Scrum Masters for the Scrum team's effectiveness. How would you, let's say if you're a manager, how do you think you would rate how good a Scrum Master is? Would that statement be enough? Like, if the team is doing good, that means their Scrum Master is good. It's way too vague for me, I guess.
I get in a way it makes it hard for you to stand out because it almost suggests that being a good Scrum Master, you almost have to be invisible. That the team should work really well together without you being center stage. Uh, I think that is true, but then it makes it, I don't know. It's almost counterintuitive that you, especially when you in within the same description, you use the word leadership, and it's almost like invisible leadership. It it's tough, but I the way that I look at it is if the team communicates effectively, if the team it almost like grows together, is at least going in the right direction.
The entire Scrum team is accountable for creating a valuable, useful increment every sprint. That's what the Scrum team final paragraph in the Scrum Guide says.
Yeah.
So if the Scrum Master is effective, then he is enabling the team to be accountable for creating a valuable, useful increment every sprint. Are they meeting their sprint goal? Or are they delivering value every sprint? Surely that's the priority.
It's almost like if the Scrum team achieves its goal of delivering that value, and they're not at each other's throats, and they kind of work very well together, and they're happy together, then you know you've ticked all the boxes.
Even so, it's a maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might take a team that hates each other but gets the work done over a team that love each other but or just don't achieve anything.
But I guess it's taking that team that hate each other and get the work done, and trying to get kind of diminish the negativity or the hostility within the team. That should in turn increase the effectiveness of the team even further.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was maybe just being a bit facetious there.
No, yeah.
All right. Let me also address something which, Gareth, we already discussed about this, but now we're doing it officially. And I think you can scroll a bit back up, Vlad, how the Scrum Master serves the team. And a lot of the times there's an expectation, and even in job posts, there's even written there that you should facilitate all Scrum events. Let's debate this, or try to enlighten our listeners of our views, or the Scrum Guide's view over the Scrum Master's involvement in the Scrum events. And I think we're also going to get to it when we discuss the daily sync, for example, and the events. But from my point of view, the Scrum Master should facilitate if needed or required, but should not happen by default. Although a lot of companies I saw expect Scrum Masters to create those meetings, to facilitate those meetings, and they're focusing on the parts that you can control almost from a Scrum Master rather than the outcomes of having a Scrum Master. So I just want to hear, Gareth, I would just want to hear your thoughts over what I've said.
I agree.
Thank you.
It completely depends on the team. With one of my teams recently, we sat down. We had a team charter, ways of working workshop, where we're looking at what, reminding ourselves just what we've been doing. What are the roles? What are our responsibilities? How do we work best? What are the things that haven't been quite working well? And one of the things I got them to do was I put out a RACI matrix. Who's responsible? Who's accountable? Who should be consulted? Who should be informed for each of the Scrum events? And also who should facilitate? And a ton of, kind of electronic Post-it notes, and got them to move things around. Who do you think is responsible for this event? Who's accountable for this? So who's responsible? Who does the work in this event? Who's accountable? Who makes sure that the work gets done? Who just needs to be told about? Who needs to be informed about stuff? Who needs to be consulted? And who facilitates? And it was that was really helpful to get them to think that through for that particular team. And I think there's some events, sprint review, for example, I think is very much in the product owner's hands. They're responsible for the product backlog. That's their show. I think the retrospective is pretty much the responsibility or the accountability, the responsibility for the Scrum Master to facilitate that, to enable that conversation. And then when you get to things like sprint planning, the way I see it is sprint planning is very much it's a negotiation, isn't it, between the product owner who owns the product backlog and the developers who own the sprint backlog. And therefore, to enable them to work and focus on their roles, I think it can be helpful for the Scrum Master to be that facilitator, to focus on the process and allow the others to just use their brains for focusing on the content. But I think it depends as well. It depends on the team, depends on their skills and their confidences, and I think it can also be useful for other members of the development team, the developers, for the whole team to be able to facilitate things, so that if the Scrum Master's on holiday, they don't just go, oh well, there's no Scrum Master, so let's cancel the retrospective. They just go, well, we just crack on. This is our collective responsibility.
Yeah, I love the examples that you gave. One more thing I would add on to that is the daily sync, and this is something that actually happened to me. Well, the daily Scrum, daily sync, daily stand-up, whatever we want to call it. But I used to officially facilitate all of the Scrum events, except for the review, as you mentioned. But for the daily Scrum, I used to naturally just fall into the pattern of facilitating, even in a remote setting, just share the screen and go through all of the tickets from right to left, from top to down. And after realizing that perhaps I shouldn't, because there's a lot of disengagement and a lot of folks were just discussing when it was their turn to discuss, I took a step back, and then I used the website wheelofnames.com, where you basically insert all of the names from the team members, you spin it, and then whoever whoever is the lucky winner facilitates Scrum for that day. And it turned out to be such a great move, such a powerful move, because the team started communicating a lot more effectively. And you would have one person who would have been silent throughout the whole meeting and would just say a few words, and they would just ask around what the tickets are, like what's happening with that one. And they would actually, because it turns out they may have been like senior developer or whatever, and they would actually say, can I help you with that? I saw you were stuck on this ticket for 2 days now. Do you need help with this? Is everything okay? Do you feel like there's anything else we can do to help? So it actually turned out great because it improved communication, it improved transparency for everyone, and the team is actually doing great even now. So yeah, just wanted to add on to what Gareth was saying.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. One of my teams is far less chaotic than yours. We just have a rota for doing that. But it's been amazing to see those members of the dev team who start off by saying, oh, I'm not very good at this. And they're very apologetic. And by 2 or 3 sprints down the line, having done it, they're doing it. They're facilitating it. They're leading those discussions, and yeah, it's a great way to help the team build its confidence and trust in each other.
No, absolutely. I fell into that kind of trap as well, as facilitating the dailies. Let's just call them the dailies, because and it just creates an unnecessary dependency. And whenever you're not there, it hinders progress. So that's why it's probably specifically said, make sure that the events take place and not facilitating. And that's also the best way, I guess, to argue with companies that expect you to facilitate those meetings, of explaining. It just creates unnecessary dependencies. You can be there in the background, but building the team and training them to be self-managing, which includes holding those events by themselves, will benefit the company. Just explain to them in the long run a lot more.
Does the Scrum Master even need to attend the daily Scrum?
No, but I think it's a compromise between a company expecting you to facilitate the meeting and what the Scrum Guide says is just make sure that the event takes place. I guess that would be the compromise of like, okay, I'll participate, but I'll be in the background, just make sure that everything goes smoothly. And even that will probably be more useful at the beginning. Once it just the team grows together and they get used to doing it, you can just not take place.
I think I want to mention something here because this actually happened to me. So to start off, it's nice to be in the background and make sure it's happening, so you don't need to be there. But I was at an interview a couple of years back, and the person who interviewed me asked me, so you do planning, you do daily stand-up, you do retro, you do review. So that's like, I don't know, 2-3 hours per week. What do you do in the rest of the time? And I was shocked. First of all, why would you ask me this in an interview when you're looking for a Scrum Master? Because hopefully you see a value in a Scrum Master. I took it as a test, like if I'm aware of what I should be doing, but I ended up having to recite the Scrum Guide almost, or having to reiterate some of the things that should happen and some of the things that shouldn't happen. So definitely I wouldn't be the main player in those events, and that's not my main job. So I wouldn't put it as I'm doing this and then I'm doing the other things. It's mostly that I'm doing the other things and I'm supporting this. So yeah. Moving forward, because I think we should. Do we want to tackle Scrum Master, serving product owner, or the organization, or do we want to put a stop to this episode and pick up where we left off in the next one?
I think we're pretty much this. If anybody wants to add anything else to the Scrum Master, we'll pick up with the Scrum events for the next episode, I think.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I want to add, if we're moving to the Scrum events next episode, one thing that I want to say is Scrum Master serves the organization as well as the team.
Yeah.
To my encounter, again, a lot of companies expect you to be a Scrum Master in the team and just stay there. So it's very useful for the Scrum Master to also look outside. And whenever I can, I try to look outside, and I try to make sure that I'm also supporting externally as well as internally. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll also kind of mention my favorite part of all of this is the first bullet point in the serves the product owner, helping find techniques for effective product goal definition and product backlog management. Helping find techniques it's almost like a never-ending task. There's always more techniques. There's always more stuff that you can learn that will not only be useful, or might be very useful now, but it'll be also very useful in the future. Is just continuously building an arsenal of techniques, skills, tools that you can use. And that's also one thing that I, to put it in your in that interview, I guess in my that you had, Andrei, might have been an answer of like, need to research how else we can improve, or continuously read, continuously learn, continuously adapt and grow. It's not just towards the team and the organization, it's towards yourself. Building your knowledge base is an active part of you. You can never be comfortable you should never be comfortable as a Scrum Master and just kind of put your feet up and say, I've learned everything that I need to learn. At this point, it's just rinse, repeat.
You can almost say it's a ways of Agile thing.
and there's never enough time to do everything you want to do.
Yeah,
it's always a matter of priorities. What needs to be improved, or what needs to be helped to flow better. And sometimes that's just, sometimes that's focusing entirely on the team or a team member, whether they're disruptive or going through, a bereavement, or, and just trying to support them and trying to help the team stay together. Or, sometimes the team's flowing quite nicely and the product owner's needing some support, or sometimes it's just kind of sitting back and observing the organization and going, what's not helping here, or what is helping here that we could be doing more? What are the opportunities? I have a never-ending to-do list.
Same. Yeah, that's a nice, scary sentiment to end on.
Yeah, so if you're out there and you want to become a Scrum Master, it's a whole bag of pain, but it's hugely rewarding. Yeah. I love it. I love it.
It's the type of job that very rarely you'll find 2 days that are the same or similar. Mm-hmm. It always changes, and you always have to adapt. All right. Exactly. So that's a more positive way of ending it. There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we can end it there then. Thank you.
Yeah. Until next time. Bye-bye.